Hello, everybody. Before we start, we're going to get going in just a minute, but if you want to come forward just a little bit, if you're sitting in a back row, I see some people back there. If you want to just move up just a little bit, that would be terrific. Thank you. And then those who straggle in late can sit in the back and not bother us. And look, here's water for you.
Good, thank you.
I don't know who did that, but it wasn't me. Hello, everybody, and thanks for coming. I'm Susan Parabo. I'm the chair of the Creative Writing Department. I know we've got a lot of people joining us on the live stream tonight, so thanks to everybody who's joined us from afar, and also thanks to Liz Toth and the Alumni Office for helping us set that up. We're thrilled to welcome back to campus our good friend and colleague, Tom Reed. As most of you know, Tom taught English and film at Dickinson for almost 40 years. He retired in 2015 and immediately started writing fiction. He had been doing a little bit before on the sly, but that's when he started doing it really seriously. And he wrote Seeking Hyde. It wasn't his first book, but it was his first novel, a historical thriller that imagined Robert Louis Stevenson on the trail of Jack the Ripper. Seeking Hyde was named a finalist in the 2018 Foreword INDIES Book of the Year Award for historical fiction. Pocketful of Poseys is Tom's second book, just out, just been out for a couple weeks, and happily he's going to read some of it to us tonight. It's a total departure from Seeking Hyde. It's a contemporary family dramedy. I feel weird using that word. It just doesn't seem right. But Foreword reviews said it better. Simultaneously heart-wrenching and comical, Foreword reviews said in their review in advance of the publication. Pocketful of Poseys follows an extended family around the world as they endeavor to fulfill their mother's last wish. Tom and Dottie now split their time between Sarasota, Florida, and their beloved Camp Pemmy in Wentworth, New Hampshire. They're also recently back from a Dickinson alumni global adventure trip to Scotland, where Tom led a group of Dickinsonians on daily hikes through historic cities, towns, and villages where some of the great Scottish writers wrote their most famous works. I was jealous of that trip every single day that it was happening. Sounds like a great time. Tom, after he reads, will be happy to answer questions from the audience, and following the reading, there will be books available. Thanks to Jeff Wood and our friends at Whistle Stop Bookshop. Jeff's out in the lobby, and we'll be happy to supply you with a copy or two, and Tom, of course, would be happy to sign for them. So very happy to welcome my friend and my fellow fiction writer back to Dickinson. Please help me in welcoming Tom Reed.
You could have said family dromedary. It's delightful to be back. Thank you so much for coming out, and thank you, Susan, and the Creative Writing Department for setting this up, and to Liz for setting up the live stream. When I first came to Dickinson, this was the planetarium, and people came over to watch fake stars on the ceiling. Now you can hear a story that's made up out of whole cloth. Pocketful of Poseys is a dark comedy, and there are going to be some things tonight that may stretch the envelope a little. There's a scene in at least a phone call to a funeral home that's dark. I think not distressing. The book is finally uplifting. I think some of the reviews have said that it's finally a buoyant book, and I think it is. But I was willing to go to some places that were not quite so buoyant in the moment, and was mining both pathos there and comedy as well. I really was aiming for those. I guess dramedy is the right word. There, I said it too. It's catching. Anyway, I'm going to read a bit tonight. I want to introduce you to some of the characters and to some of the pathos and to some of the humor as well. So I'm going to kick it off with a passage that will introduce you to Sidney Posey. When I wrote the book about Robert Louis Stevenson, I was really, I won't say shackled, but it was easy to sort of figure out what I was going to be talking about because I was working within his biography for the first two-thirds of the book. And so essentially I just went from Claire Harmon's biography, I'd read a bunch of them, but then went to the chapters that I wanted to write, and I sort of invented the words that he was saying to lead up to the writing of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And starting my second book, I felt, I'm going to go for a little more freedom here. I'm going to try to be a little less trammeled. And so I decided just to make a story up. There's some guidelines, I think, in terms of how it all got started. But I really wanted to be a little more free and easy. And the main character, at least the central matriarch of the Posey family, Sidney Posey, is about as free and wild and easy a character as I've encountered, at least in my writing and maybe in the writing that I've read. She went to Woodstock, and as you'll see if you read the book all the way through, make it all the way through, Woodstock was a kind of defining moment for her, not only in terms of its conjuring up this vision of a potentially idealized world, but also in terms of some of the things that she indulged in there and how they spun out over the course of her life. But she is an interesting character, and if I can read my notes here, I can figure out what I'm actually reading first. I wanted to begin with a kind of look at the fact that she becomes a writer of sorts. She's a writer of children's stories, and the irony here is I was moving away from Stevenson and the sort of writing in shackles, looking for freedom, and I invented yet another writer. So Sidney Posey, I'm going to read you a very brief section about the things that she wrote and how she tried to get them published. And this is about as far and whacked out as I got in the course of writing this book. So anyway, here we go. Right before this part I'm going to read, Grace Posey and Brian Posey, who are Sidney's children, they are twins, fraternal twins, get themselves born, and then immediately a rip-roaring case of postpartum depression kept Sidney housebound until the relentless visits from Frank's mother became more insupportable than any degree of lingering melancholy. At which point, Sidney snapped out of her funk with a speed that took Frank's breath away. For a while, she arranged for one of Frank's students to look after the children one day a week while she resumed her volunteer work at Planned Parenthood. Then in art class, Frank, her husband, lined up for her, reignited an old Oberlin passion, and she began to draft and illustrate her own children's books at least that featured children. Frank hadn't been sure whether his wife's prime creative goal was parental nurturance or progressive satire. To him, it was as though Jonathan Swift had decided to rewrite Mother Goose. Where sausages come from seemed meant to do for the under-8 set what The Jungle had done for the adult reading public many decades earlier. It's okay to laugh if anything strikes you as funny here. The unkindest cut shone a critical spotlight on the questionable practice of tail docking and ear clipping with select breeds of dogs, Frank having successfully diverted her from an earlier focus on various forms of human genital mutilation. And Say Goodbye to Bessie told the moving story of a Nebraska farm girl who learns of the passing of her pet calf over a plate of homemade veal piccata. With this last especially, Frank secretly wondered if his wife's postpartum woes hadn't been supplanted by something demonic. Frustratingly, Cindy's efforts to find either agent or publisher met with little success. One editor tactfully wrote, "What is it basically with your meat obsession?" and suggested she consider a story about root vegetables. It wasn't until she dialed back on her drive to be truly innovative that she managed to place and publish Marky Has an Accident. Luckily, the critics were more favorably disposed than Frank to Cindy's eccentric parental vision, lauding her book as, quote, "a disarmingly honest foray into childhood leakage of all sorts," unquote, with illustrations that, quote, "playfully evoke all of the requisite messy realities, yet with a palette and a style that recall the French pointillists," unquote. Her children, young as they were, remained less sure of the book's excellence. Brian had worried that Marky's dimpled, vomiting cheeks looked suspiciously like his own, while Grace was certain the book was really about her own admittedly erratic progress towards evacuative control. I have to say that one of my fellow travelers on this Dickinson writer's tour of Scotland, Connie Rockman, is a graduate of Dickinson in the 1960s. I hope she's watching this stream. She's just finished the book, and she said when she got to this passage, she was delighted because she was a child's literature librarian for her entire life and was actually chairing the committee for the Caldecott Medal. And Cindy actually hopes that one of these books will eventually get a Caldecott, but I don't think it'll happen unless Connie makes it happen. Anyway, Connie, hi. Thank you for joining us. All right. We're going to go back now to the very beginning of the book, and I want to do a kind of cold start here, just to sort of get you into the book as though you just picked it up. There are a couple things you need to know. One is that Jimmy is a cat, J-I-M-I, named after Jimi Hendrix. Cindy's had a long line of cats. There's Ravi, there's Arlo, there's Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young. They're all from one litter. But her cat most recently is Jimmy. So when you come across his name here, that's who it is. Okay, Grace. Grace is the daughter. Grace Tingley always struggled letting herself... Oh, I should also say that there's an F-bomb here. When I was at Dickinson, I didn't know there's salty language out in the world, but I retired and moved to Florida, and damn, there's salty language. And I decided either I could ignore it and keep it out of my fiction strenuously, or I could just let it in, and I decided to let it in. So you tell me afterwards if I made a mistake or not. The other thing to say is that Woodstock, well, I guess I have already said it, Woodstock plays a fair role in the plot here. Grace Tingley always struggled letting herself into her mother's cottage, especially when her arms were full. Cindy Posey's front door had a handle as quirky as its owner. Unless you pressed the latch down with one hand just so while you twisted the key with the other, you might as well have been trying to husk a coconut with a plastic spoon. Grace huffed in exasperation, dropped the bundle of clothing onto the brick stoop, and did it the only way that worked. It had been raining for 24 hours, but the door swung open with its usual dry squeak. Grace took a deep breath and bent down for the things her mother had portentously announced she wouldn't be needing anymore. "Shit," Grace muttered as she straightened up. The puddle on the stoop hadn't looked deep, but an added weight to the clothes and a chill seep of water through her sleeve told Grace otherwise. She stepped into the narrow entryway, wiped her feet half-heartedly on the mat, and nudged the door closed with her butt. Her mother's things were still dripping when she reached the laundry room and dumped the pile on top of the washer. She had plenty of time to deal with them. Plenty of time, too, to grab a mop and soak up her wet footprints in the trail of rainwater from Lucinda Maynard Posey's last load of everyday wash. Grace eyed the ring-pocked sweater she draped over her mother's undergarments so they wouldn't be on display if anyone spied her, scurrying through the lingering March showers back to the level 3 deluxe she'd talked her parents into taking years back. "We don't need that much space anymore," her mother had protested. "I'd be happy in a tent." "Do you think you might possibly have visitors?" Grace had retorted. "Maybe children who love you?" Grace walked back to the kitchen, tossed her coat onto the counter, and tugged open the refrigerator. The cold air flowed down and around her bare ankles like invisible liquid. The fridge was still depressingly empty, mute testimony to her mother's dwindled appetite and Grace's own disinclination, honestly, to settle into her current familial role. Low-fat milk, low-fat yogurt, some celery and carrots in the veggie drawer, a squeezed bottle of Grey Poupon, a jar of Hellman's Light, 3 half-empty cans of Jimmy's wet food, chicken choice, tuna treat, and tasty turkey. Grace hadn't touched any of them, dreading the musty stench she knew they'd exude at room temperature. Jimmy seemed to be doing just fine on dry Friskies anyway. Grace grabbed one of the bottles of Sauvignon Blanc she might have slammed it first, slotted into the bottom rack, swept the door shut with her knee, and walked across to the island. Yesterday's unwashed stem glass looked perfectly reusable. She twisted off the cap, poured a healthy measure, and trudged over to the couch. The sigh that escaped her as she sank into the deep cushions would have passed muster in the house of Usher. "Hang in there, Gracie," she said as she tipped back a hearty gulp. Jimmy materialized out of nowhere and leapt up beside her. He stared at her briefly, his eyes saucer-wide and his marbled nose flaring with the smell she'd brought in from outside, then curled up to lick his luxurious tail. Grace reached for her phone. She'd switched it off that morning, not her habit, but there'd been some big items on the day's docket. The screen lit to the press of her thumb. It was a relief to see nothing more than a 3 in the red ball above the WhatsApp icon. The first message was from her husband, Jack, back in Connecticut. "Been thinking about you a bunch, honeypot. Call me after a glass or two. Miss and love you." Grace grinned and hit Chelsea next to a tiny picture of a smiling blonde 20-something woman sporting trendy sunglasses on a beach in Aruba. Or had it been Antigua? "Wish I could be there, Mom. Give Nana my love and give me a call after you've had something to eat. Only if you want to. You're the best daughter ever and the best mom." Heart emoji. Chell. Grace kicked off her shoes, crossed her ankles on the coffee table, and took another serious pull. The next line read, "Brian." Smirking amiably out from the image ball was a handsome 40-plus man with a trim brown beard and a baseball cap that read, "Life is good." A snow-capped volcano loomed in the background. If the picture were bigger, you might have seen that his eyes were Grace's eyes too, wide-set, direct, blue. She pressed to see what her fraternal twin and soul sibling had to say. "What the hell, Grace? The nursing director called to say you're not letting Mom eat. What the fuck is going on?" "Bloody hell," said Grace. So in the next bit, we'll find out why Brian is upset. Okay, we met Cindy, we met Grace, who's Cindy's daughter. We met Brian. Jack is the son-in-law. Chelsea's the granddaughter. I guess we know that Frank was the grandfather. He was a Dartmouth professor. He dies in a car accident just before the bit I'm about to read, in a section of I-91 that Dottie and I drove by yesterday. It's funny, in Scotland, we kept going to these places that Stevenson had written about and kidnapped, and I kept thinking, these are the places that these things really happened, the Saws Inn and in the Queen's Ferry. And now that I've written something, there are locations in my book, and I drive by and think, man, that's where that really happened. Very strange. I want to go and put a little cross up, to Frank Posey on that curve in 91, but I'm not sure the Vermont State Police are going to let me do it. Anyway, the other thing to know is that Brian has married a woman, a realtor in Seattle named Ella. He's been in a relationship with a man from Jamaica named Kingsley Shaw for years and years, but he finally meets Ella and falls in love with her. And along with Ella comes Sage, a 16-year-old nihilist feminist socialist. who I started out thinking was just going to be a kind of thorn in the side of all the characters, and she ended up, I think, being about the best character in the book. I really came to love her. She really is the one that got away. Jenny Ortega is going to play her part if we ever turn this into a movie. If you know Wednesday, and pray for me. I hope that happens. Anyway, this is going to explain what's going on with Brian and the food and so forth. Frank has just died. That spring, Cindy had begun to notice a tremor in her right hand. She thought at first that it might be the byproduct of some exercise classes she'd been taking, but weeks and then months passed with no improvement. Grace had tried to reassure her. Neurological ructions were par for the course as one matured, she insisted. And what's the difference, Cindy asked, between maturing and withering? Grace said she should be glad she still turned heads at the co-op every time she went grocery shopping. Great, Cindy replied. Now I'm the hot granny who can't stop twerking. True to form, Cindy kept on joking about her condition, making no effort to hide it from anyone. One of the more memorable blushes that she ever drew from her daughter was that Thanksgiving, when Grace and Jack and Chelsea had driven up from Westport and Brian bussed up from Boston. They'd all been sitting around the dinner table after a gargantuan turkey course when Cindy power-trembled a slice of pumpkin pie right off the pie server and onto the tablecloth. Shaking her head, she tittered, "It's such a pity Frank's gone. Can you imagine the hand jobs I could be giving him?" Brian laughed so hard he'd thrown up in his mouth. Cindy reddened mightily and left the room. As bravely as she'd carried on, Cindy was secretly terrified. Her own mother had died of Parkinson's disease when she was just a little older than Cindy, after years of being cared for in her sister's home while she slid deeper and deeper into motor incompetence and dementia. At first, Cindy refused to seek medical advice, dreading what might be confirmed. The tremor grew worse, though, and it cropped up on her left side, too. Grace and Brian finally convinced her to see a specialist. One of New England's most celebrated neurologists was based at Dartmouth-Hitchcock Medical Center, and Cindy agreed to meet with him as soon as it could be arranged. A month later, she dutifully kept her word, only to be told that the only way to diagnose her condition, short of an autopsy, which she said she wasn't quite ready for, was to put her on a Parkinson's medication and see if the symptoms diminished. If they did, she probably had the disease. If they didn't, it had to be something else. That's about as sensible as throwing me off the roof of the hospital, Cindy argued. If I glide down, I'm a flying squirrel. If I'm killed, I was something else. She told Grace that evening that she must have wandered by mistake into the proctology department. All she'd seen at the hospital that day was a huge asshole. Before long, the fall started. The first time after she'd gotten up in the middle of the night to pee, Cindy managed to get back on her feet and stagger back to bed, where she lay until dawn, staring grimly at the spinning ceiling fan. The second time, though, she couldn't for the life of her get off the floor and had to crawl to the den to find a phone low enough to reach to call the main desk for help. The talk at their regular care plan consults had turned to the advisability of assisted living. Cindy had spent a lifetime flitting from one enthusiasm to the next, and when she wasn't flitting, throwing herself body and soul into helping others. The prospect of assisted living was as appealing to her as double amputation at the knee. Since the neurologist's proposed diagnostic leap seemed almost sensible in comparison, she agreed to give it a try. Unfortunately, she'd always been hypersensitive to drugs of any kind. For Cindy, a standard-strength Tylenol was like a triple dose of Nembutal. As a result, whenever she'd suffered from one of her headaches, she'd enlisted Frank or later Brian to rub her temples until the pain subsided. It might have been inevitable then that the trial of levodopa wasn't particularly successful. The pills reduced her tremor, but only by suppressing almost every other sign of life as well. She tolerated Cinnamon no better. A woman who had always sparkled like a burning fuse now plodded through the days of her trial with an affect as flat as month-old roadkill. Grace had driven up from Westport to take stock of things and phoned Brian to say their mother had turned into a zombie. He'd quipped nervously that Grace should lock her bedroom door at night. So Cindy, he said, couldn't sneak in and eat her brain. "Mom's not eating anything," Grace replied. That same night, Cindy fell again. She hit her head on the bathtub going down, and even though she swore over and over in a lifelessly chilly voice that if she hadn't passed out, Grace called the EMTs. The ambulance sped her mother to Hitchcock, where a CAT scan detected no intracranial bleeding. Hanover Hills insisted, however, that she move to their special care unit for several days to be observed and assessed for placement. Meanwhile, they discontinued all pharmaceutical experiments. As for residential placement, although Cindy had insisted on going back to her cottage and cat post-haste, Grace had to agree with the chief staff physician and director of nursing that the time for assisted living had sadly arrived. When she shared the news with her mother, Cindy raised herself bolt upright in bed and declared in a voice that shook the room like a subway train rumbling into the station, "I'll be goddamned if I'm going to have you wiping my ass, Gracie Posey, you or anyone else. If I can't wipe my own ass, I just want to get the hell out of here like your dad did." If Grace hadn't been stunned by the bellow her ailing mother managed to produce, and even more by the stark practical implications of her nixing any change in her level of care, she might have asked what Cindy had meant by that cryptic, "like your dad did," as that she and her mother might be able to discuss the options the following morning. Grace slept miserably that night, anticipating a dawning conversation come sunrise. As long as she remained within earshot, Cindy had fumed continuously, claiming that an unholy alliance between her own daughter and a place that was bilking her for $80,000 a year was plotting to lock her up in diapers and set her in front of the shopping channel for 12 hours a day. It also hadn't helped Grace's quest for sleep that Jimmy kept coming into the guest bedroom, jumping up onto her pillow and muffling her like a furry CPAP. She toyed with calling Brian as soon as she got back to the cottage to bring him up to speed, but there would be more to talk about tomorrow. Besides, he was so prickly lately about matters of Mom that she hadn't wanted to put herself through an unnecessary call. Still, she worried that she should have. In the morning, Cindy claimed to have slept like a baby. She remained adamantly against any move to assisted living. But to be honest, she allowed, I have been thinking about assisted dying. Grace's mouth had fallen open. Seriously, Cindy said. Mom, Grace gasped, what are you talking about? Look at me, Gracie. I don't eat. I can't walk 10 feet without taking a digger. I shake as bad as your dad did the first time he tried to have sex with me. Mom! Well, he did. You should have seen him. He was petrified. Of course, it was kind of cold out there on the golf course. Mom, Grace said again, blushing, we have some serious decisions to make. Tell me about it. Really, said Grace. Really? Nobody knows that better than I, said Cindy. I'm serious, though. About what? Asked Grace, as though the question might shut them off onto an entirely different track. About Tom Brady, maybe, or the future of Social Security. About dying, Cindy said simply. About just calling it quits on all this nonsense and going to be with Frank. She coughed softly into a closed fist. Mom, you don't even believe in the afterlife. It sounds romantic, though, doesn't it? Cindy grinned like a septuagenarian pixie. And the doctors don't know I'm an agnostic. Grace began to sense her mother was serious. What have the doctors got to do with it, she asked. They're the ones that can get me into a hospice program. Oh, God, Grace shook her head vigorously. Oh, God, what? Said Cindy. Mom, you have so much to live for. There's Chelsea. She loves you so much. Your books are still selling incredibly well. Cindy flapped her hand dismissively. And Brian just got married to a wonderful woman. You have a new stepdaughter you barely even know yet. And there's Jimmy. Cindy stared at her coolly. Jimmy's a sweetie, she said. But am I supposed to want to keep living for a cat? Grace heaved a great sigh. Hospice is for people who are already dying. We don't even know that you're dying. I do, said Cindy. So you're suddenly an effing doctor? Grace cringed. She'd almost yelled. She was slipping back into a pattern she knew only too well. What was it with mothers and daughters? It was like the love came with strict instructions not to engage in it for more than 20 minutes without disassembling it for cleaning in an acid bath. Look at me, Cindy croaked. I am looking at you, Mom. And? Cindy's eyes probed her daughter's face. She looked like an early Christian peering across the Colosseum towards the lion door. Her tremor only added to the effect. Grace opened her mouth to speak and closed it again. It was true. For anyone who hadn't known Cindy in her prime, even 3 years earlier, she might have looked today like a reasonably healthy 75-year-old. On the thin side, maybe, and slow-moving when she reached for things or tried to walk. And sure, she might need to use 2 hands to steady her coffee mug. But Grace still remembered her mother as recently as the year her father died, looking and acting more like an Olympic decathlete with reading glasses than like any woman remotely her age. Grace breathed in deeply, let out the air, and nodded. Cindy smiled. Grace, Frank and I worked so hard to keep you and Brian from seeing how bad things were for your grandmother. And Aunt Ruth, how she just went down and down like a lead weight, She held her fist up to her mouth again, sniffed twice, and shook her head. Maybe that was a mistake. Maybe we should have let you see what Mom was going through. We saw, said Grace after a beat, both of us, and we talked about it, then and lately too. Cindy cocked an eyebrow at her skeptically, and Grace felt tears pushing up. We don't want that for you, Mom. Oh, honey, come over here. Cindy reached out, the sleeves of her gown pulling back over the slack skin of her upper arms. Grace jumped up and rushed into her mother's embrace. The bed lurched and bumped into the nightstand, sending a plastic mug careening onto the floor where it bounced in a spray of brown liquid. That's okay, honey, Cindy said, squeezing her daughter and then reaching up to stroke her hair. Their coffee sucks. $80,000 a year and their coffee sucks. Grace had burst out laughing, then sat up and swiped at her eyes with the backs of her fingers, gazing into her mother's face. She thought Cindy might be shaking in some new way, but no, she was just nodding. Now she was grinning. Oh, Mom, said Grace, the tears flowing again, you're still so here. You're still so, oh, God, I don't know. She grabbed Cindy's hand and laughed again. I am still here, honey. I need you to know that. Brian, too. And I need you to hear me and help me slip away while I can still wear my fancy undies before these humorless bastards kit me out in dignity pants. Grace had been slow to respond, caught in a Bermuda Triangle of admiration, resignation, and regret. There had been times in the past when she had almost wished her mother were dead. Provisionally, when Cindy had told her that the dress she'd chosen for the junior prom made her look like Shirley Temple, fresh off a month-long ice cream vendor. Most definitely when she dragged Grace in for an HIV test after it emerged that her star quarterback boyfriend at Hanover High was having sex with other boys. Now, though, the thought of her mother leaving this earth felt like it would end time itself. How was she supposed to get back around to wishing her mother were dead, or at least helping her realize that wish for herself? Okay, Mom, she'd sighed after what might have seemed a cruelly long pause. How do you plan to do this? I'll just stop eating, Cindy said. Can you really do that? You mean, is it legal in the state of New Hampshire? Not really, Grace smiled, but is it? It is. What's illegal is helping somebody else, certainly everybody else. Cindy leaned forward as Grace could adjust her pillows. No, by supporting someone's decision or feeding them such shit meals they stop eating in self-defense. What you can't do is, say, slip them pills or give them a loaded gun. How do you know this? Asked Grace, struggling with a sudden urge to vomit. Is this something you've, been thinking about for a while? Not exactly, honey, Cindy grimaced. Let's not get into it, okay? Grace stared at her mother. She looked like a withered wallflower, hoping to be asked out onto the dance floor for one last time. Okay, so you wouldn't be facing a jail term, but not eating at all? Do you really think you could manage that? You've seen the fridge at the cottage, Cindy said, smiling. I'm probably already halfway there. So that's where Grace finds out what her mom wants. She then has to convince her brother Brian to go on with it, and they also have to convince the people at the nursing home to go along with it. And actually, although most of them are on board, at one point a young woman comes in and tries to feed Cindy some pureed meatloaf. And Grace goes off on her, and at that point, the director of nursing calls Brian and says, your sister is starving your mother. And of course, she's not, but that causes that ruction. Okay, the next scene is the funeral home scene. And after Cindy dies, she's planning on sending Grace and Brian with their families on a trip around the world to sprinkle their ashes in 6 locations. And she includes with her instructions letters talking about why that place is important to her. And these letters actually reveal a great deal about their mother's past that they had not been aware of. It's to this extent an epistolary novel. I don't know if you guys know what that is. The first novels written in English were letters. Samuel Richardson wrote a couple of them. Pamela is one. Clarissa is another. And I was doing an interview the other day, and somebody said, "You've written an epistolary novel." And I said, "What?" I was trying to break away from, historical forms, and this person pointed out that, yes, there are letters from Cindy to the main characters. And so I have to admit that it is kind of an epistolary novel, but not much. So anyway, there's a dark humor warning that comes with this passage. And here we go. Cindy has made arrangements to have her mother cremated, and the funeral home says that the ashes will be ready in about a week. She can come back up and get them. And she realizes before she goes up there that she's going to have to transport the ashes by airplane. And she looks up regulations. You can't fly ashes on an airplane in a container that's not scannable by an electronic device. And so she wants to get ahead of the curve and make sure that the people at the funeral home actually have her set up with the right thing. But again, she's assuming that she's not going to be able to go for a week to pick this up, and she decides to call Tuttle's Funeral Home in White River Junction, Vermont. "Tuttle's Funeral Home," said the woman who picked up. "Always ready, always respectful. Megan speaking." "Hello, Megan, this is Grace Tingley." Grace fought the urge to point out how tacky it was for a mortician to be boasting, "always ready." How medieval, basically. "I'm Cindy Posey's, Lucinda Posey's daughter?" "Yes, Ms. Tingley. It's about my mother." "Your mother? She's here?" Grace hesitated. "I certainly hope so." "Let me see." Grace heard shuffling papers. "Ah, yes," said Megan, "here she is." Grace had a fleeting vision of Megan standing in a large room with shrouded bodies scattered over a variety of surfaces, like rising loaves of bread. "Silly me, it says right here, Posey Lucinda, Hanover Hills, 1 March 2019. "That's her," said Grace. "How can I help you then, Miss Tingley, aside from saying how very sorry we are that your mother has passed?" "Well, I'm calling because we'll be transporting my mother's remains via airplane, and I wanted to make sure she was packed, that her ashes were in an appropriate container." "Ah, for the scanner at the airport." "Right," said Grace. "Well, what did you request by way of an urn?" "I honestly don't recall," confessed Grace. "There were so many details to attend to. Their appointment with Bradford Tuttle, the stereotypically oleaginous funeral director, had struck Grace and Brian as easily lasting longer than the average college final exam, lengthened even more by the fact that almost every utterance the man voiced involved increasingly wearing references to your dear departed loved one. Grace didn't feel the least bit guilty about forgetting a detail or two. "Well, most people this month have chosen the sidereal ewer," observed Megan. "It's on special at a 40% markdown. Twice glazed ceramic with a screw-down lid." "I honestly don't recall," Grace repeated. "Let's just check our firing log here," said Megan. "Yes, Lucinda Posey. She's in a sidereal ewer, cozy as can be." Grace took a moment to reprocess what she just heard. "What do you mean she's in it?" "Well, the cremains, of course. When the procedure is complete, all the remains are carefully transported to the chosen container, in this case, the sidereal ewer. I think you'll love it, by the way. It's gorgeous, one of our most tasteful models." "Wait a minute," said Grace. "You're telling me Mom's been cremated?" "Well, yes," Megan answered. "She was supposed to be, wasn't she?" Grace heard an additional rustling of papers, more frenzied this time. "Of course," Grace heaved a great sigh. "It's just, you're telling me the cremation has already been completed?" "Very much so," Megan paused. "Is there a problem?" "Only that I was told it wouldn't be for a few more days yet." Ah, no, the boys must have found things went quicker than expected. You know, all the processing. Okay, said Grace, got it. Mom's done. But she's evidently in the wrong kind of container to fly. Oh, goodness, thank you for pointing that out. You're absolutely right. And can we change that? Well, I don't see why not, said Megan. I'll have to check with Mr. Tuttle for final clearance, but I'm sure something can be arranged. Perfect, said Grace. What are the options? Well, let me see. Scanner friendly, TSE approved. The woman made a little tisking noise with her tongue. It reminded Grace of Brian. There's the Vermont Maple Haven. That's wood, obviously. Genuine machine carved in relief, it says here, with beloved scenes derived from the unforgettable poetic musings of Robert Frost. Right, said Grace, and the Champlain Chalice with lovely embossed high country lakeside landscape. Oh, and the Green Mountain Grail, perfect resting spot after life's long trail. Those are both plastic, very tasteful though, thick, solid. Grace heard the sound of knuckles rapping on a desk. Mom was a real believer in sustainability. Do you have anything in a recycled paper product? I do believe we do. Let's see. Well, yes, you're in luck. Megan sounded delighted. There's the World Love mini casket. It's recycled cardboard with a potato starch glaze. Very earth-friendly. I believe a lot of the eco-loonies at Dartmouth choose it. The eco-loonies? Asked Grace. Oh, gosh, said Megan. Excuse me, I shouldn't have said that. She tittered nervously. It's just a little joke we have down here in White River. No worries, said Grace, relieved to be presented with an obvious choice. Given Cindy's sojourn at Yasgur's farm, something called the World Love Casket seemed the perfect receptacle, mini or no. So can you just have Mom's ashes transferred to the World Love thing? Of course. I'm certain Mr. Tuttle will approve, said Megan. And will there be an additional charge? Or maybe if it's cardboard, we'd even get a little money back. Grace smiled. Well, said Megan, I'm afraid the World Love mini casket is still $249. It's a very specialized item. Oh, naturally, said Grace, sliding an additional notch toward exasperation. I expect the glaze is made from the finest organic Idaho baking potatoes. Pardon? Asked Megan. Nothing. Forget it, said Grace. We'll pay for the World Love thing, whatever. And of course, we'll still have to charge you for the sidereal ewer. Really? Why? Well, we can't reuse it once your mother has been vacated. When I wrote this, I didn't know the term vacated. It's become key to American government, hasn't it? The Speaker of the House has been vacated. Anyway, we can't reuse it once your mother has been vacated. I don't think anyone else would want to go in there, do you? No offense to your mother. I don't suppose you thought of cleaning it out, said Grace, perhaps a little too loudly. Reverently? And what would we do with the bits of your mother that were in there with the washwater? No, I'm afraid we can't reuse an urn that's already contained a loved one, but we'd be very happy to give you the sidereal ewer used in any way you see fit. Well, that's just wonderful, said Grace. I'm sure we're eternally grateful. You're very welcome, said Megan. Grace took a moment to gather herself. So I was planning on driving up in 3 days. Can you have everything ready by then? We'll do the very best we can, said Megan. Like Mr. Tuttle always said, eternity's too long to get things wrong. My sentiments exactly, Megan. Thank you so much. After all the talk of ashes, I need a sip of water here. Okay, let me check the time. I had two more I was going to do. Let me just do one of them. This is the passage I promised Grace Jarvis, Mickey Jarvis, and I don't think the character's named after you, Grace, but she's a very admirable woman and a great mother, so it could well be you. But anyway, it's the passage that really gives the book its name, its title, and it's also the passage that, as I was brainstorming about it with a very good friend, gave me a sense of what the whole tone of it was going to be. The two things you need to know, Chelsea's in a relationship with an older man. and her parents don't necessarily feel comfortable with that. And there's a reference to tiramisu in the book, and you should know that when Frank and Cindy met at Oberlin College, I'm not sure there are any Oberlin grads in the room right now, but there are on staff, I know. Chris is Oberlin, right? And Christine Mitchell, I think, is in Oberlin. Yeah, I think so. Anyway, but they met at Oberlin, which is where my parents went to college. And unlike my parents, they founded a co-op, a co-ed co-op, which served 2 naked banquets a year, one on Valentine's Day and one on, what was it, Thanksgiving or something like that. And one of the things they did was serve dessert up to each other on the other's naked abs. So that tells you a lot about Frank and Cindy's relationship. And it's something you needed to know before I read this bit, which is the last I'll read tonight. So remember, this is where the title of the book is coming from, and it is taking place in Rome. For dinner, they walked back towards the Villa Borghese and had an excellent meal at a restaurant lined with huge mural photographs of Fellini film stars. When the waiter cleared the last dinner plates, Grace suggested everybody consider tiramisus for dessert. Ella looked up from her menu. What's tiramisus? That's what I called tiramisu when I was little, volunteered Chelsea. It kind of stuck, basically freezing me forever at age 4. Which, Jack added loudly, makes her current live-in even more of a cradle robber. Encouraged and paced by Brian, Jack had downed more than enough wine to forget Grace's ongoing ban on references to Chelsea's domestic arrangements. Ouch, he exclaimed as the toe of Grace's shoe crashed into his shin. Fucking hell, Grace! You know, Ella chirped brightly, ending the awkward pause in conversation. Kids' names for things are just so cute. Don't, snapped Sage. She glared at her mother over tightly folded arms. Sage, honey, I mean it, Mom. If you trout out any of my kitty cutisms, I'm going to go out and fillet every homeless Italian dude I can find. And I might have to join her, said Chelsea, laughing. Well, okay then, responded Ella. I'll bite my tongue. Brian leaned against her with a tipsy wink. Maybe I can bite it later, too. Grace threw up her hands. What is it? Is Mom scripting our dialogue here? She'd love it, said Brian, and she'd probably have special instructions for serving tiramisus. 20 minutes on, Grace set down her fork and carefully folded her napkin. Okay, what's the plan? Brian leaned forward with his elbows on the table. Maybe we should do a little reconnaissance. Go over to St. Peter's tomorrow and check out the lay of the land. Sounds smart, said Grace. I'm pretty sure the whole square's paved. I doubt there are any planters or anything either. Brian shook his head. Nope, checked online. Nothing close to the obelisk except a ring of stone bollards. So where do we put the ashes, asked Ella. That's why we scouted out, replied Brian. Case the joint. Jack burped, then slapped his wrist. Cut it out, Jack. Brian grinned at his brother-in-law. If the gaps between the stones are big enough, we could take a broom or something and sweep Mom and Dad into the cracks. Sweep Nana and Pop-Pop? Chelsea's eyes bugged out. Into the cracks? Sure, said Jack, like you sweep sand in around new pavers when you build, say, a carriage house. He looked at Grace and stifled another burp. I know sweeping sounds a little irreverent, Brian allowed, but how many options do we have? Listen up, said Jack, setting down his second limoncello with a loud smack of the lips. We've got two separate challenges as I see it. There's the where do the ashes end up challenge, and there's the how do we get them onto the ground in the first place challenge, given the prying eyes of the public. Chelsea looked at the others. That's right. We can't just go over to Rome's biggest tourist attraction, open up some baggies and empty them out on the pavement. We could go at night, suggested Sage, like in Koh Phi Phi, Thailand. The whole place is lit up at night, said Brian. The front of the church, and then there are these big lamps right next to the obelisk. We'd be even more conspicuous doing something weird when there are no tourists around. We could go in the daytime, said Jack. Maybe, replied Brian. Get lost in the crowd. Maybe. I could hold the bag up in front of my face and sneeze, suggested Jack. He slid forward in his chair. All the ashes fly out, right? And I say, sorry, coal miner, black lung. He looked around the table, inviting a grin. Maybe, said Brian, with a sidelong glance at Grace. Jack snapped his fingers and sat up even straighter. Or we could do the Great Escape thing. What's the Great Escape thing? Asked Chelsea. The Great Escape thing. There's this movie about prisoners of a Nazi POW camp. Steve McQueen, said Jack. They want to tunnel out under their building and escape. The only problem is they have all this dirt they have to get rid of somewhere without the guards figuring out what they're doing. Okay, said Chelsea. So they come up with a system to sneak the dirt out bit by bit in their pants pockets. Like they just turn their pockets inside out, asked Sage. Wouldn't the guards see that and be suspicious? Jack shook his head. I told you they rigged the system. When they get to where the dirt's going, they pull this little string and the bottom of the pocket opens up and the dirt just falls down their pant leg to the ground. Then they shake it off their shoes, smile at the guards, and go back for another pocketful. It's a great movie, said Brian. I don't know, though, Jack. I'd be so into it. Jack actually bounced in his seat. You load me up at the hotel, and I'm strolling all cool and relaxed up to the obelisk, and I get right to where we want the ashes, and I pull the string, and, repeated Grace. Jack's eyes twinkled. Maybe I'm having trouble with the string. And I pull, and nothing happens. And every time I pull, my pant leg jumps up and down. He stood up to demonstrate, yanking up on his pocket. Sit down, Jack, hissed Grace, scanning the room. You're embarrassing us. Jack sat down, but his excitement was undiminished. Maybe there's this couple standing next to me. Maybe they're from Korea or Bosnia or something. And the guy asks, what's the trouble, sir? And I say, nothing, really. And he says, can I help? And I say, no, thanks. I'm just trying to get my mother-in-law out of my pants. Jack sat back and started to guffaw. He looked happily around the table as the others joined in. That's really funny, Jack, said Chelsea. I figured there might be a mother-in-law joke coming. Don't forget, though, Pop would be in there, too. Right, said Brian. You'd have a pocket full of posies, Jack. Plural. Jack snorted. It's funnier with just a mother-in-law. He drained his limoncello. A man's got the right to control what goes on in his own pants. And women don't? Asked Sage. Word, said Chelsea. So Sage and Chelsea are 16 and 24, and they bond in this book over their sense of the shared difficulties of women in this world. And by this point in the book, they're allies. So that's it. That's all I will read. Thank you. You've been a great audience. And I will be delighted to have any questions asked, and I will do my best to answer them. I've planted none. Yes, John. How long did it take? I was working on it pretty regularly for maybe a year, and then I sort of set it down and let it germinate a little bit, and then I went back. And I actually sent it to my publisher. When I got the contract for the first book, Seeking Hyde, I had to sign away my rights to place the second one anywhere, so it had to go back to Beaufort. And I sent it to them, and they sat on it for quite a long time, and I kept thinking, well, this is not good. This is not good news. So I finally contacted them, and they said they loved it, but it could have come out sooner. But yeah, maybe it took a year. But I was retired, and as Dottie will say, I wrote 2 or 3 hours a day, pretty much. When I went out for walks, I thought about what I was doing, and so had I had another world going at the time, it would have taken longer. And then once you get something placed, the editors want some changes, and you have to go back and cut some darlings out and all that. And honestly, every time you come back to a book, I mean, getting ready to read tonight, I was thinking, well, why did I put that word there? You never let it go. You have to let it go, and you sort of wish you didn't. And the other thing about letting go is you can fall in love with your characters, and when you finish, you just kind of weep. And the best responses you get from your readers are when they say that too. They say, I'm really sorry that I had to finish. I want to go back and start over again. And you hope they're not saying it because they couldn't follow it. Anyway, yeah. Other questions? Claire.
Thank you for reading that. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
There are so few contemporary novels, at least, about adult siblings and that special and fraught relationship. Could you talk about how
Not without revealing a great deal about my own past relationship with my sister. No, I definitely built, my sister is 4 years older than I, and the idea of Cindy dying didn't come from her dying, but she died 4 or 5 years ago from what we think might have been Parkinson's. So that might have allowed her to come in this other way to this book. But she was 4 years older than I, brilliant woman, a polymath. She was a brilliant medieval scholar. She started a company doing AIDS research. She wrote all the biographies for all of the dancers of the Canadian National Ballet. She co-wrote Karen Kane, the great Canadian dancer's autobiography. She was pretty remarkable. She got into Harvard and I didn't. She had the gall to tell me, well, if you couldn't go to Harvard, Yale is the other place I would very much like you to go, you know. So anyway, you get the idea that my sister and I had a bit of a vexed relationship. And the backstory of that is my grandfather started a boys' camp in New Hampshire that my sister couldn't go to. So, I mean, as soon as she realized that, she was tooth and nail feminist, and ultimately she dragged me along, much to my betterment. But anyway, yeah, my sister was always a little bit ahead of me. I was known in Providence as Penelope Reed's brother, and Brian is known in Hanover as Grace Posey's brother. Yeah, it's building on that. We had a very good relationship. She loved the fact that I had kids. She never had kids, and she took it upon herself to spoil them in just about every way she could. And she always brought them things like huge drums and goop, and she called herself Auntie Hell. And they always loved it when Auntie Hell was coming to the house. And I'd look at Dottie and say, well, here she goes. This is really important to her. We got to let her do this. Anyway, there she was, and she left us too soon. And I think in some ways the book is in large part about Grace and Brian coming together and forgiving each other and loving each other. Brian says early on that he figures that Grace was born first because she elbowed him in the eye on the way out of the uterus or something like that. But one of the parts of the knitting and healing at the end of this book is Brian and Grace finally getting on the same page with each other. And I had not really thought about that until this very moment, but I think probably the reason for that is that's my reconciliation with my sister. So I won't weep here, but I'm feeling the pre-wellings. Yeah, the other expiatory moment for me when Frank and Cindy go to Grindelwald to go skiing. Cindy hates it. And that's based on the year I was in Oxford and I took my then girlfriend who wanted to go to Club Med, dragged her off to Grindelwald and made her ski, and she hated it, and she went back to Oxford early. And I always felt guilty about that. And in the book, Jack, who's got a watch fetish, watch collection, takes Grace off and buys her a watch, which is very unusual for him to have done. And it's this scene where he's finally getting outside of himself and his materialism, and he's really seeing that there's something more important. He knows it, but he's acting on the fact there's something more important in the relationship than his own desires. So he buys her this watch, and she's incredibly touched. And she sees him as being very generous, and she finally understands what's so cool about watches, because she's got one on her wrist now. And that scene, I think, was my penance for dragging Marcia Halstead off to go skiing in 1976. So there's a lot of, when you write a book like this in your latter years, and there's a lot of mining of your past decisions and successes and failures that goes on. And I just hope it makes a good story for other people, because it sure makes a rich experience as you're writing it. And I don't know that you can really write things well unless they're rich for you somehow. You got to find that place where you're even if it's a comedy, you got to be bleeding for your characters. You have to have to feel that. And it's what's amazing to me is to see young people writing incredibly good stuff. Maybe Jack and Toby right in this room. Where do they find that? And that's not to underestimate the kinds of incredible challenges kids go through from very young, and I think probably more now than in the past. So it's certainly vital experiences, but I think it's probably good, even for those young people who have had hard times, to let those hard times into their writing, because that's where the blood is, that's where the passion is, and that's where you find the answers, and you find self-forgiveness and forgiveness of others. I really believe that fiction is a place for people to understand each other and to make the world better. You were just saying that on the way over here. I believe that. Any other questions? Yes?
How did you know when you were done?
How did I know when I was done?
Yeah, how do you know that you were just you're done writing your story, you're ready to send it off to the publisher? Or is
Yeah.
part of writing that you're never truly satisfied with, you always want to have more?
Yeah, I mean, you're never truly satisfied. I was sort of suggesting that earlier, but I knew I was done with this when everybody was home. And one of the last scenes I wrote introduces a new character. It's Chelsea's older boyfriend, Gran, and so I wrote this sort of closing thing for him, and he hadn't even been a character earlier in the book, and I don't know how well it works, but you get them home and you show that they've been changed by what they went through, and I wanted, particularly because Cindy's life was in some ways so harrowing, I wanted everybody to get to a place without being a Pollyanna about it. I wanted everybody to get to a place where her suffering and her honesty about it had an impact on them and made them better. And when I had that feeling, I felt it was done. And somebody asked me in an interview, what should you get out of this book? What is the message? And I hadn't really thought about it, but the message is, I think that honesty is a form of love. And honesty can be wrenching, and it can be heavy and loaded and disconcerting, but it can be a form of love to tell people the truth. And I think there's not enough of that kind of love around. And if my book can convince a couple of people to give the gift of honesty, that's going to be good. But yeah, it's the feeling you create a conflict and you resolve a conflict. I mean, that's the simplest way of saying it. And when you feel like it's resolved, then it's done, and then you cry a little bit and say goodbye to the characters. Yeah, it's a wonderful question. I mean, how do you know ever what's done? I mean, if you're painting your house, how do you know when you've got it just right? Really, I mean, because there's always a corner you haven't painted. I think the Gothic cathedral is one of my favorite things because there are all these parts of a Gothic cathedral that nobody ever sees, but there's stuff up there. There's gargoyles and roof bosses, and nobody's ever going to see them but the sculptor and God. But they weren't done. They put those things up there, and then finally, they look up in an aisle, and all the crossings of the roofs there's something there, and they say, okay, that's it, I'm done. And the other, I'll stop in just a second, but I think there's that opening of Scripture, God talking about the creation, and He knew it was good. He does all this work, and God knows it's good. I think that's an interesting way of talking about something that I believe only a God could know that something is really good. There's some people that think things are good, and they're totally, the best. We have the best, but they're not. But it's an interesting way to think about the difference between us and God, because God can know if something is good, and we hope it is. We get good reviews, but not enough people are buying our books, and the wrong people are saying critical things. We want to know that, and I think we want to know that we're done, but I don't think we ever know we're done any more than we know we're good. We just have to send it to the publisher, and unless the second edition comes out, it's not going to change. So, great question. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed coming back to my home here, and I am more than happy to sign any books you would like. So.
Thank you.
I'll probably be out there.